Hello, my name is Andrew King, and I'm going to talk about the Russian history of Northern California. Now, at one point, the Russian Empire actually claimed parts of Northern California as part of their territory. There was a lucrative fur trade that extended from Alaska down the Pacific Northwest coast all the way down to the San Francisco Bay. Now, they didn't just claim this territory. In 1812, they built a fort on what is now the Sonoma coast north of San Francisco. In addition, several small farming communities sprang up in the same area. Now, this certainly caught the attention of the Spanish, who had not settled anything north of the San Francisco Bay prior to the Russian settlements in the early 1800s. Once the Russians began establishing themselves, the Spanish became very wary, and they actually built their first missions north of San Francisco, specifically to keep an eye on Russian activity. The Spanish built their northernmost mission in what is now the heart of the town of Sonoma. It was Mission San Francisco de Solano, and it was built specifically to monitor Russian activities in the area. Now, being that this was at the frontier of both empires, the Russian and the Spanish, they did not really have the resources to fight each other over the territory, but they could just, sit back and keep an eye on each other, and that's about the most that they could do. Now, the Russians maintained Fort Ross for almost 30 years. There, when the fur trade dried up, they would eventually abandon the fort, but that was not before Mexico declared independence from Spain. Now, Mexico was a lot less keen on allowing the Russians to continue their claim to the area once they declared independence. But again, they really didn't have the resources to fully kick the Russians out, per se. However, as the 1840s approached, you were reaching a period where the United States was moving in from the east. You had Mexico to the south, and you had the Russians in the north. And so what is now Sonoma County today, at one point in its history, saw three empires, so to speak, closing in on one little part of California. And the town of Sonoma, what many people outside of California may not know, was the site of the Bear Flag Revolt, which is when the settlers declared independence from Mexico, and they were fully expecting to be absorbed into the United States, but there was a time where they declared California as the California Republic, independent from Mexico. This was around the same time that the Russians were planning to leave, because there was really no more reason for them to be there. They had the fur trade was not nearly as lucrative as it was when they first arrived, and so then when the United States Army moved in, California was annexed, and here we are today. And so, for a short time, you had the Spanish, then Mexico, the Russians, and the United States converging on one county in California, Sonoma County. Now, just to give you an idea, you have San Francisco here. If you go up the coast, this is where you see Fort Ross. This is about a 2-hour drive. And if you notice, if you can see up close here, that there is still some of the Russian heritage. There's a river, a fairly substantial river, that's called the Russian River. It's right up here. Runs all the way to the coast. And then you actually have the town of Sebastopol, which is you have a Russian name. And there's still a lot of Russian heritage in the North Bay. People, like I said, outside Northern California may not even realize exists. This is an aerial view. This is what is left of Fort Ross. You still have the chapel. You still have living quarters. There are even some cannons that they still have there. There's an old cemetery. You can't see it here, but there is a Russian cemetery. When this was in full swing, there would have been a whole community here of Native Americans who worked for the Russians when it came to the fur trade. There were farming communities nearby that were Russian. And then this is the inside of Fort Ross. This is would have been the Orthodox chapel here. Now, if you're an elementary school kid who grows up in the North Bay, you have certainly been to Fort Ross. In fact, when I was in the 5th grade, we spent a couple of nights there, and we got to live like Russian settlers. I was in the militia, and I got to carry around a saber, and I thought that was fantastic. I was in the 5th grade. So that was just a little bit of the history of Northern California, the history of Fort Ross and the Russian settlement. And it's fascinating to think that if you live in Northern California, you might be speaking Russian today. But obviously it didn't turn out that way. So thank you, and thank you for listening.